I can talk a little bit about what we're going to do, and hopefully they'll show up in a minute. Okay, so recording, excellent. So welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Alana James. Today we're talking about bias in research. And I want some caveats on today's conversation. So, because this is going out to a lot of you who are in very different fields, doing very different kinds of research. And yet bias is a subject that cuts across all of our work. When I was refreshing my memory on bias to set up these slides, I remembered that, remembered that qualitative people and quantitative people use very different language. And I think that's, and then authors, being what we are in research, always wanting to have our own language, end up using different language from each other too, for things that are really pretty minuscule in their difference. So here's what I did to make this presentation as useful to you as possible. I tried to marry some of the language pieces so that you could extract what might be true for your field and and that said, you may have to double check that sometimes that language is exactly what you want to say. But we're going to have a good conversation about the overview of bias, how it affects us, what kinds of bias there are, and how you can protect against it for your own work. All right, so I'm seeing that we're getting some loud and clear, and if I could just see a slide, that would be useful. So let me see if I can get my slides up on my other screen. There we go. Excellent. I've already told us that's our agenda. What is bias? What's the effects are, types of bias to watch out for, and tests. And now, a little bit different than usual so bias is elusive. Let's just be really clear about that. And why can't we see it? It's a lot like why we can't edit our own work very well. We don't see what our mind is not prepared to see. And so when we're looking at our own research design, it's always good to have 2 or 3 other eyes looking at it as well. A reason for that in this particular instance is that bias is interwoven with how we think about things, with what we see as normal behavior, with how statistics work, etc. It's a complex, bias comes into the center of a lot of the complexities of research. So we define it as a systematic weakness in judgment. I've underlined the word systematic here because it's set up in the way we do business. It isn't just something that happens or doesn't happen in our heads, but because of what happens and how we see the world and how we put our research together, we can cause it to fail from the very beginning because of how we put it together. That's the systematic weakness. It causes us to deviate from measurable truth. And it's a regular deviation from that. I'll get into the specifics of that in a little later. So it pushes our results towards something or against something. And for that reason, our results are skewed. It leads us towards a bad decision, and it leads us towards erroneous conclusions. So, short, sweet definition is its preconceptions in action, usually without realizing it. So the reasons can be the way we think. It can also be our motivations, and it also can be our cultural background. We have to, and I think you're probably come across this at other times. Certainly you'll come across it in other pd.education material. I'm a very strong believer in reflective research practice, because the more we understand how we think, what motivates us, and what our personal culture has to do with our view of the world and therefore our research, the less likely we have bias that shows up. Or at least when we do, we can own it easily and we can move on beyond it. All right, now that I've been kind of airy-fairy and woo-woo about it, let's just talk about what it does. It has really strong consequences. So if we are biased in our design of the research, the long-term consequences that our results are useless and our conclusions invalid. If we have bias in the way we interpret the results, then we come to invalid conclusions as well. But real specifically for you as students who are doing research, it's going to slow you down. If you're thinking about your research design and you don't think with enough concrete reflection on what your biases and how they may affect your design, hopefully they will be caught during your reading for or your defensive proposal. I say hopefully because while it'll be a big pain in your neck because you're going to have to rewrite whole sections of your defense, at least you'll have caught it. If you don't catch it during defense, and that can happen because frequently the committee during defense are having conversations not so much about the specifics of the design and the specifics of the methodology. They expect that to get caught during the IRB. So then you can go all the way through defensive proposal, all the way to your IRB application, and then have the IRB people send you back to rewrite your questions or rewrite your the way your data will be collected or what instrument you use. So pretty strong rewrites because they disagree with whether or not your methodology is biased. Now, it is possible for you to go through those two things and actually get results. And then when you're trying to get your results put together, you can find that they don't lead to any defensible conclusions. So your findings are skewed, and then you go back and you realize that your sample wasn't broad enough. You didn't take outliers into account. You got a whole lot of data that doesn't make sense. Those are the outcomes of bias. And then heaven helped us that hopefully this doesn't happen. But at the very end, if bias wasn't caught, it could show up as part of your final defense. Because you have committee members who are then looking seriously at your results and they're just not making sense to them. And then through the conversation, you backtrack to a very subtle but improper assumption that was made at the very beginning that made the whole thing go south. And you absolutely do not want that to happen to you. So it's important. It's subtle and it's important. All right, now let's talk about it in concrete terms. And this is where I'm going to do the integration of a couple of types of language. So you may have your professors, other people taught research, may be talking to you about bias as selection bias, analysis bias, or procedural or administrative bias. So I'm putting those in parentheses as SB, AB, and PAB. And they refer, this is usually quantitative language, and it refers to when in the process your bias may cause a certain result. But in my opinion, the language of the qualitative research And I am biased when it comes to qualitative research because it was my initial training in research. But to me, it makes more sense because it's human driven. And if we know the ways we are thinking and how that can be incorrect or not as open as we want it to be, then we can know, and then we can tie that down to when in the methodological process those kinds of assumptions may cause difficulty. So I'm going to focus on the types of bias as discussed by qualitative researchers, and then I'm going to have some indication of when that thought process may show up in selection analysis or procedural administrative bias. So I hope that makes sense to you. And it's for this reason that I gave you these slides in the handouts. Again, depending on your field and whether you're a master's student or a doctoral student and what you're studying, so there's a lot of depends there, you may be required to discuss specifically in writing what you have done to avoid bias as part of your research design. And then it'll be useful for you to have this language to refer to. So you have the slides. But for now, let's just discuss the ideas. The big one, the one that most people think of when they think of bias, is confirmation bias. And confirmation bias will affect everything you do. Selection, it'll affect your selection, it'll affect your analysis, and it'll affect every part of your procedure or administration of your research. And what it says is that we don't acknowledge that there are any other points of view in the world but our own. Now that's the big one, but we just aren't ever, we all have confirmation bias. I think it's a human characteristic. And whether it's big or it's small, it means that I'm going about my life. I'm pretty sure that I've got my life well together, and I don't realize to what extent everyone else out there is different from me. And everyone else out there is going to have a slightly different point of view than me. So it can be horrendous. It can be I'm, just set in my ways and no one can talk to me about anything that isn't. And maybe, unfortunately, we know some people like that, but it also can be very subtle. It's the kind of thing that causes communication breakdown in couples and families, in work places. It's the confirmation bias is what we do teamwork building to get over. So we understand that people that we work with think differently than we do about everything. And when we pin it down to research, it means that the more we are aware of what our biases are, the less likely we're going to have blind spots where we can see the bias in others. We certainly see when they're assuming something that isn't what we assume, but it's much more difficult for us to see what we assume that they know isn't the same. So I think I had 2 slides there. Let me look. No. Okay. Now there's researchers being what we are, and all of us liking to hone our own language. There are several biases that go along with confirmation bias. So very similar, slightly different language. Projection bias, where we're focusing on the perspectives that are similar to our own, and we're ignoring and dismissing those that challenge our point of view. And this will happen if we're laying out, so I'm going to jump to engineering. If we're laying out a simulation and we believe it's going to work a certain way, it's a good time when we're designing that simulation, other people who are challenging what we're doing or how we're doing it. If we don't, we have projection bias, and it may cause our simulation not to work. So that's from an engineering point of view. But I think you can see where it's going to be true of all of us as we go through our process. So it's procedural. It's also, and I've written it down here as an analysis problem, because now we have our data and we've got clear results, but what do those results mean? We need to be open to people who challenge our point of view. And you can see it's a different form of confirmation bias. So at the end of the day, we want to have people around us who don't have the same beliefs as we do and who don't agree with us. And then we want to be open to what they say. Same kind of thing, in-group bias, same kind of problems. In-group bias can cause problems with selection, however. So selection's the beginning when we're, in some languages, we're putting our samples together. In some languages, we're choosing. I know that frequently people who come to these webinars are doing soil analysis. Well, if we assume that every soil in our area is just like the one that's closest to where we are, then obviously we're making a selection problem. And that's all under this heading of what I know, what's my group, what's my close to me. You can, in-group is obviously designed for people who are doing qualitative work, and literally means, if I'm an older white guy, I only study older white guys. And I bring that one up because that was true in medicine for a long time. Right now, medicine is definitely pushing really hard to get different kinds of medical results for women, different kinds of medical results for people who come from different cultural backgrounds, because we all present with different symptoms for similar medical things. So that's an in-group bias problem that colored medical science for, unfortunately, 50 or more years. Research focused on one position ignores the importance of contextual differences, male, female, etc., does not consider outliers. So this is the first time I'm bringing up the word outlier. And I'm using a word that is very specific to the idea that the outliers in the system, the ones that are on the edges of our nice bell curve, in times of change may actually point to the way the curve is changing. So I was educated as a teacher. Long time ago, students used to come in, sit down, get their books out, and do work. Then we would have seen a few students who were not doing that, and they were the outliers, and there was all kinds of problems with the outliers. And how much different education could have been if our research could have seen that as a point towards the future and begun to do innovations on interesting classrooms, inclusion of students, etc. So frequently, in-group bias causes us not to see change when it's coming. And for any of you who believe that your research is at the leading edge of looking towards where something might be changing, I just want to highlight to you, you absolutely want to be designing research that uncovers the outliers, just for that reason. Okay, now, then we have a couple of things that go with, I thought these two were so similar, I just had to put them together. So there's buyer's Stockholm bias and there's bandwagon effect bias. Basically, they are a point at which the researcher makes decisions because they're have they're inhibited. They have a fear, maybe fear might be too strong, but for some reason they're uncomfortable challenging authority. And authority might be the bigwigs in your field. It might be your committee chair. It might be whoever. But as you go through your research design process, and you're building your power as a researcher, be aware of when somebody says something and it makes you uncomfortable. And then if it makes you uncomfortable because of the previous biases we've talked about, then good. It's uncovering bias. But if it makes it uncomfortable and it makes you shut down what otherwise was what you felt was an innovative idea, then you want to do some deep reflexive thinking about whether or not it had to do with one of these. This causes us to follow the ideas and behaviors of others despite evidence to the contrary. And it's the word evidence here that I want to underline, because if you have evidence that your way of thinking is the way that moves forward, then you want to push back. If other people are challenging you, and whether they're authorities or not, might make you uncomfortable, go search for the evidence to see if you're right. That's the outcome of that slide. Okay, observational selection bias causes us to overestimate the importance of our data or the impact of our research. So this is a we just think it's that our research is bigger or better than it is, and it really impacts the way we write it up at the end, because at the end we're required to talk about the significance of our work and what it means for the future. And if we have observational selection bias, then we're going to think we did a much better, bigger job than we did. When it actually impacts our work is in the way we set up, in the way we select, and in the way we analyze. So we're assuming here that the frequency of an event or something has increased after we selected it. We're assuming that this is a big, let me see if I can think of an example. I actually can. When you're studying violence and the degree of violence in an area, it's a moment in time kind of study. And another thing that I've studied in my own life was homelessness. Again, a moment in time study. But if you're thinking that homelessness is growing, then you make everything bigger than the moment in time study you got. Same with violence. And I know for those of you, unfortunately, in the United States, it's a lot of different kinds of violence are much more rampant, and they increase every year. But to the extent where people are reacting to or researching that more than what is evidence-based, more than what the actual numbers, then we're setting up a selection bias or an analysis bias. And I hope some of the things I'm saying here touch some of your, because we have quite a few people here today, touch your research directly, and you can come back to me with a question about it. Because I was really torn. There's a lot of these, and I was really torn about, should I leave them out? No, I wanted to give you all the language. But as I said, sometimes it's subtle between one thing and another, and you will have to determine for your study which ones of these hit home, like, oh, I could really have that one. And then I'm going to search it out and make sure it isn't there and be able to write about how I did that when I propose my work. Measurement bias, and this has to do primarily in quantitative studies when tools or instruments have not been assessed for validity and reliability. Anchoring effect. Oh, and let me go back on that one. Because in some fields like psychology, and I've been involved with quite a few students who've been trying to search out finding an instrument for their study. And it ends up that there is no instrument for their study. There is a few questions here, a few questions there, or they have to modify an instrument. And as soon as you do that, your instrument is no longer valid and reliable. Because of the potential of measurement bias, you'll need to write up those changes very specifically if you have a strict IRB that you're up against, or because they'll be on the lookout for measurement bias when you change your instruments because of the validity and reliability issue. Okay, anchoring effect bias. It's another overestimation or incorrect evaluation based on the data because we had a restricted sample. And this goes on to the what medicine did about, the most personal and to me, because I'm an older woman, is that what they say, what for years and years, what they said, how you could determine whether you were having a stroke or a heart attack was all based on male data. And in fact, women present very differently. So that's a clear example for you about what overestimation or evaluation based on a restricted sample can do in the long run to an entire field. It goes to where you could collect your collection of the sample could be based on limited criteria. Now, this could be done because you didn't fully understand the problem. So I'm going to talk qualitatively here. I'll just use the school violence as an example because it's something that I've studied in the past. And if you were to look at a school population, you'd be looking at one school population and you'd be looking at perhaps even a cohort within that school population, and you'd be looking at, whether or not they had access to weapons, whether or not maybe you'd be doing a survey on what they thought about violence, etc. Well, right away, you can see that you can't extrapolate to any other school within a school district because all of them are made up quite differently racially and ethnically. So you can't have long, broad-based effects unless you collected a sample, and then it would have to be a sample that was randomly selected. It just gets into these for a student level researcher, you can get into some really impossible challenges because you're trying to drill into a sample base and not have some kind of anchoring effect bias. Which leads me to the fact that depending on your study, you can put caveats or boundaries around it and literally write up the fact that there will be anchoring effect bias because it is here. It's a known issue. It will limit the study in these ways, but you believe, and the significance of the study over arches those concerns because it will have this and this and this positive effect. My own committee chair told me a long time that when dealing with bias, you figure out which ones you may have that you can't do anything about, And then you put them on the table as limitations, because once they're written up as a limitation to your study, they can't be brought up as they can be discussed. Other people can say, why did you accept these limitations? But it keeps your study on solid ground. And but to be aware here that what you're going to be up against, if you do have an anchoring effect bias that's innate in the study, can't do anything about it because you can't possibly do the type of research that would get you past it, is that you have to acknowledge it may cause you to compare and contrast things, and that they have to use that same limited criteria. So you can't extrapolate to the big picture if you've limited, if you have a restricted sample, limited criteria. Okay, negativity bias. And this may come up more just in personal interactions, I think, than in research. But some people are just more prone to pay attention to the negative than to the positive. And that would have to do with the way you were analyzing. So if you find, as you have your data and you've neutrally listed your results, that the negative oriented results, well, for that matter, if the positive oriented results, if either one of those seems to have more weight to you, you have a bias to be concerned with. That's an analysis bias, because both cause us to disproportionately assign importance or credibility to that particular side of the situation. You'll see it in newscasts a lot, that because I think most of us would agree that news is disproportionately a negative, promotes negative journalism. Current moment bias is one of those that may affect your committee chair if you have a particularly innovative study. It's a procedural or administrative bias that puts edges on research because the researcher or their committee chair can't imagine an environment different than the one that we are now in. Computer science is going to have an issue with this one, probably because certainly 5 years ago, we could not have imagined some of the things that we're researching today. So the steps that got us here would have been hard to have research data about. This results in a failure to innovate, and it hampers the significance of the work long term. And I think then, just to go back to that one for a second, you can see, and the reason I gave you these slides is I know you're going to take these and go back to your own work at some point. And then I want you to go through them and think, is this me? Is this my setup? Are these the tonality of the people I am, myself, and the people I am working with? And then from that kind of level of, oh yeah, so and so tends to always put extra emphasis on the negative, then you can go to that bias and you can see what its results are, and you can decide if it's going to cause an analysis problem and how you're going to work around that. So that's the reason for all of those different kinds of bias, and some indication to you of what they might run into and how they might cause trouble. Okay, now let's talk about how you test for them. This is much more concrete, because no matter what those biases are, these tests help. And they're pretty obvious, some of them. First is to reflect and to look for and challenge pre-existing assumptions and hypotheses in our own work we can hand things that we're concerned about to someone else and ask them to challenge our assumptions and hypotheses. And when you are basing your work on the research of others, you can go through their work looking for assumptions and pre-existing assumptions and hypotheses. I'll just give you an example. When I was teaching Ed.D. doctorates, frequently someone would come with a leadership problem that they wanted to study, and they were almost always based on the fact that they had had a bad leader, and they really wanted to study kind of what that did to the school, how that was set up. Their pre-existing assumption and hypothesis was that their own personal experience was caused by a bad leader. So if your work is evolving out of your own personal experience, be aware there is your pre-existing assumption. And if your hypothesis for your work includes that assumption, you have a big bias that you're going to have to seriously work to get over. You also want, so then when you see that, yeah, there might be some assumptions and hypotheses that I hold in my heart, then I want to look at my research questions to determine if the questions are set up in such a way as that they would tend to get that slant of an answer. Now, not all of you are going to have questions. Some of you are going to have the way your samples are collected. If it's science, some of you are going to have the way a simulation is set up if you're in computer science or engineering. So take this research question piece and look at anything that has to do with the way things are sampled or the way things are set up, and then determine if you could get unexpected results. That's what you want. You want to have, that's when research is magic. That's actually when research is a great deal of fun. When you get a wide range of results, and sure, they cluster, and maybe that was kind of what they expected, but you get some other outliers that weren't what you expected. Those are the ones that cause you to drill down into what your topic is and eventually and learn more. So you want to sample. If you do have some of those pre-existing things, then how do you sample for an opposing point of view? If it's people, you get a whole lot of different kinds of people. But if it's soil samples, how wide a range, etc. And another test is that you never omit results, especially when you've got this really pesky 2 or 3 that don't have anything to do with anybody else. You need to consider whether or not they are in fact outliers and why, how they might change your overall perspective. Number 4 can be the magic that makes your analysis really shine. It also takes more work. So, but be aware, you're looking for those outliers. You want to build an instrument that encourages a wide range of questions and answers. You want to ensure, and that if you are doing a qualitative study, then it's all about the people being comfortable. So you don't want to do a questionnaire that takes them an hour, because at the end of the hour, they're not comfortable. You also want to make sure that you're not their boss, or there's no power differential that's slanted towards you. You don't want to set up a situation where they want to give you the answers they think you want to hear. You want to stick to the data, evidence, and results, and when you make up your findings. No extrapolation is best. You want to stick to what the things show you. And that's difficult in a qualitative study because you're kind of mushing together the way people talk and the way we articulate things, and trying to come up with a clear stream of what you found without taking 6 pages to write it out. And only conclude or publish findings when you have a robust level of data. So it's no harm in saying this was a very limited study. You can still, if it passes your chair, you can still graduate, but you don't actually want to conclude it or publish it when you're feeling like you just really didn't have enough to make a wide, to have your significance really impact your field. And then when you're actually analyzing your data, you want to sort and resort it into different types, different contexts, different, however many ways you can resort this, whether it's words you're working with or it's numbers you're working with, so that you're looking for, if I look at it this way, are there outliers? If I look at it this way, are there outliers? When it comes to the working with humans, typically this part is done by having a second level of questioning. So I question a few people, I get a certain amount of information, and then I go looking for someone who has a really different point of view, and I let them tell me if what I've understood so far is spot on, because they will bring in a different point of view that will expand my understanding. I do that a few more times. I do it again. So as much as I have the ability to analyze as I go along and look for the next thing that gives me a different kind of answer, the broader base my answers will be. Others edit with an eye to bias. So to the extent it's always helpful if we just have people who are researchers read our work and we ask them, please, to point out things that might be biased. Let's see. I kind of zoomed through that, didn't I? So we're down to me saying, I hope you have only the best and unbiased results. But I want to leave time. And so I will definitely, I took 10 minutes to get this started. And I can't see you in this view because I'm on a different device than usual. But if you have questions or you want to think this through in terms of your own research, I'm delighted by that. But I need to know a question is coming. So if you would just type an X in the chat box, then I'll wait and I'll know that there's some deeper questioning to come. And if I don't see any X's, then you should know that you can come back to me later and ask some questions. I'm happy to talk things through with you or to type things through with you. And you can reach me at Alana, ALANA, at doctoralnet.com, which is the second part of the on the screen, doctoralnet.com. It's our bigger business name. So let's see. Do you have questions? Was this useful to you? I felt like it was going to be just a huge amount of ideas thrown, and I want to come back to bias is human. We're all going to have some of it. It's useful as we're doing our research to look at the possibilities, and it's very useful to have other people help us unpack it. Okay, so I'm not seeing any X's, and I am seeing that it was useful. Just dipping my toe in the research process. This was helpful and easy to understand. Good. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Dipping toes, always good to get a sense of where we can go wrong. And I back to wishing you really only the best in your research. I think research is such a fun game. So may you all have unbiased results. And thank you so much for coming. With that, I will stop the recording.